Good. Okay. Thank you very much for coming today. My name is Farah Al-Muslimi, and I am the Yemen specialist at Chatham House. Today we have two exceptional speakers on the anniversary of 4 years of a foreign military intervention in Yemen and the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. We have Rafat Al-Akhali, who is the former Minister of Youth and Sport in Yemen, but also an associate fellow at Oxford University right now, the Belventic School. And we also have Jane Kiminant. I've tried that very much. My British didn't work. Who also works with the elders right now and was in the past also associate fellow with the Chatham House, deputy head of the Middle East. But thank you very much again for coming. And we will start this panel by probably deep diving into the domestic situation in Yemen. How has 4 years changed this country? What is the trends we're seeing? And then we will go back into Jane to cover a bit more of the regional. But if you can walk us, Rafat, on the domestic complexities and how this war has changed Yemen in the last 4 years.
Great, thanks. And thanks to everyone for coming. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of... If I may interrupt,
the communication just reminded me this is a live-streamed event, and it is on the record.
So. Okay. Good to know.
Yes.
And as Farah said, it is unfortunate that we are now 4 years from the start of the conflict in Yemen. And a lot has changed in the country. Unfortunately, a lot negatively has changed in the country over the 4 years. Maybe, if I may, maybe just take a very macro view and try to look at some of the trends that we are seeing in different areas of Yemen and also in the different sectors. And I think one of the three trends I'd like to speak about regarding the domestic side, we are seeing in the Houthi-controlled areas, I think the major trend that we are seeing is an increasing turn into what we could term like a police state. Houthis, after 4 years of war, becoming increasingly paranoid, becoming increasingly cracking down on civil society, on freedoms of expression, on any form of what they see as threatening to their efforts, including, for example, on any peace-building activities. It's not allowed. Any activities of international NGOs, including humanitarian and others, are very closely scrutinized, monitored, regulated, not allowed unless they have full control of it. And I think also a rise in their ideological identification as a movement and in their efforts to spread the ideology as well. We are seeing increasingly these cultural activities that they are hosting, cultural training camps, daily radio speeches of Abdul Malik al-Houthi giving religious sermons, weekly gatherings in their main centers where Abdul Malik al-Houthi gives video lectures to his followers. So an increasing, and I think only expected after 4 years of war, to turn back to try and mobilize around both the ideological and the tribal aspects of the movement. And so they are entrenched further and further into that, and the crackdown is happening. And that's what everyone feels in the Houthi-controlled areas. That's daily life for them, is an increasing life of fear of crackdown and one ideology kind of shaping the narratives there. On the other side, we see in government-controlled areas, what we see is a lot of fragmentation, unfortunately. What we see is a very weak, again, central government, if you could call it central. Very weak leadership from the top, and over the 4 years only getting worse. And because of that, and because of other factors as well, a lot of fragmentation at the governorate level, each governorate going their own way, depending on the different situations, the leadership in that governorate, the kind of resources that they have, where they fall in their relationship with the coalition partners. But the trend is very clear. Each side, each governorate, each sometimes below the governorate level, each district is going a different way. And increasingly, that's a challenge, how to bring back that common sense of one country or one even at the region level or at the governorate level. And so that's another trend that we see over the 4 years increasingly happening. The third trend is related, of course, to the humanitarian and economic situation. Humanitarian crisis, as we all know, which is the big focus, and I'll speak a little bit maybe about that later. But the humanitarian situation deteriorating, getting much worse over the 4 years. Jobs almost disappearing totally, both in the public and private sector. Lots of challenges for getting food into the country and out. The banking sector facing huge challenges there as well. And so the humanitarian crisis is only getting worse over the 4 years. But on the other side, the economic side, which is not getting as much attention as the direct humanitarian crisis. So the humanitarians are very good at, let's say, mobilizing. And it's easy to identify quickly with the images and then mobilize, more food shipments or more aid. But it's not resolving the structural issues that we have, in terms of the macroeconomic factors as a central bank, the currency, and all that. And unfortunately, we are not seeing as much focus on resolving those issues, and absolutely no leadership internationally on addressing those economic issues. And maybe that's something we can explore a little bit, this humanitarian economic divide. So that's the main three trends that we are seeing. There are another two trends that I would like to focus on and touch on very briefly. One is as it relates to the relationship with the coalition partners, which again, over the 4 years, we have seen a deterioration, I would say, in that kind of relationship and coordination between the two. We are seeing increasingly a lot of discontent on the ground among the population, but also among the political elites at some of the activities of the coalition. And the way that the coalition deals in different governorates where they have more control. And more importantly, a lot of concern is raised about these different militia groups that are supported under different names: security forces, security belts, elite forces, paid for, trained for, and paid much higher salaries than the Yemeni military, let's say, or the Yemeni public salaries that are afforded, and no clarity over what is the long-term view for that. At some point that will stop. What do we do with all these created military organizations, and how do we ensure it doesn't turn against the state or against the general population as well once the funding stops? So that is a real issue of concern. We are seeing a lot of friction, and increasingly that friction over the 4 years between the government and the coalition partners, and this lack of clarity over what is the exact relationship. And of course, understandably, I'm sure the weakness that I talked about in the government side is a big factor into how the coalition is trying to figure out how to do in Yemen, how to support this government. And on the other side, there's a lot of, I think, other factors as well. The last trend that I want to touch on is the international efforts on Yemen. And I think we have seen the international attention only focusing through increasingly the humanitarian lens. So a lot of the coverage internationally on Yemen, a lot of the action is focused on the humanitarian side, which is of course needed and appreciated, but very little on the political side. And when we look at the political side, the international community has mostly been looking at Yemen through the Saudi lens, I would say. It's mostly through trying to figure out how do we satisfy Saudi or help Saudi achieve its objectives out of this war, but not enough about how do we get Yemen out of this war, regardless of the different interests in the region and internationally. So we see these blips of attention every now and then, and there's a peace talk like the ones in Stockholm, for example, but no real mobilization internationally to end this war. The two times that we saw these blips of attention, for example, the Kerry initiative back at the end of 2016, when there was actual attention and actual, it made it to the top of the agenda for the Secretary of State of the United States. When we saw a little bit of movement back then and actually an agreement was prepared and signed and everything, then attention goes somewhere else and it winds. Then the second time was when both Pompeo and Mattis issued their statements late last year. And again, a lot of attention, a lot of push ended up in Stockholm, and then attention went somewhere else. So these are kind of big macro trends, and we can dig deeper.
Before I jump to Jen, I wanted to follow up with one question. First is Stockholm Agreement, which is the most recent thing in the news. Is the glass full or half full of water or half full of blood? What's happening to that agreement? What's the possibility of this? And then also, Jen can follow up on the regional aspect of this, but can you tell us a bit also is how much of this is a coalition? Is it a UAE-Saudi thing, or are we being deceptive by saying the coalition? What's behind it? Who's the main lead in this, and the relationship between these two actors mostly? Is it like a concrete new regional order that's functioning in Yemen and in relationship with Yemen, or is it like another rushed up WhatsApp group? Where do we go there?
I think the Stockholm Agreement was, as we all know, at a very high level. So I was also fortunate or unfortunate to be there in Stockholm. But a lot of the push was to try and get something, and initially there was a very low bar of expectations. It was just about as long as they show up and as long as they commit to meet again in a couple months. So that was kind of the bar. And then as people showed up and everything started building up steam, I think the bar raised too much maybe. And there was now expectations that we can get something around that. I think it was a big achievement that we got the Houthis agreement in place, basically to at least save a lot of destruction that would have happened, a lot of losses of life. So I think putting the brakes on the Houthis battle was a good thing if it was followed up by actually implementing the agreement. But everything else was at a very high level, only as a sense of getting the ball rolling. So if we talk about the Taiz understanding on Taiz, it was empty basically. It was just, let's agree to continue talking. That's all it said. The agreement, I think, on the exchange of prisoners, that was much more detailed. It was happening already before Stockholm. Unfortunately, it got tied into that as well. But I think the key out of Stockholm is that we cannot continue to be at the very high level. I think the special envoy and his office, they've focused on the big framework, but as everyone knows, in Yemen, it's all the complexities that are there, and the devil is always in the details. And if we're not willing to go down to the details and figure out some of these, it's very difficult to happen. On the second question, probably Jane can add more, but I think it's very clear, at least when I talk about the coalition, I talk about Saudi and UAE. Yeah. I think they have the backing of the other countries that are in the coalition, but they are the main actors right now, both in the military side and the economic and humanitarian side, and they are the ones visible in Yemen at least.
Jane, walk us through this from a regional point of view. 4 years ago, some thought this was a Sunday thing. Some have recommended that you read the Ottomans or the Egyptian archive. Clearly, 4 years later, that things are not what everyone expected. But what does this also mean was it a new regional order? How does the complexities recently between Qatar and the rest of the Gulf countries, or some of them, play out into Yemen? And most importantly, how much is Yemen or is not going to be affected by the Iran deal? But mostly is how did the Gulf, if at all, change, or the politics within the Gulf change because of Yemen's military foreign intervention?
Well, it's probably a symptom of the new regional disorder, which shows little sign of abating, sadly. I hope that there will be more sustained engagement this time with the peace talks, because I think the perception in the West has changed a lot. When the war broke out, it was neglected and marginalised and got very little coverage. And it's now become an issue in domestic politics, which is very heated in the US and UK, because it's so closely associated with Saudi Arabia. And of course, Saudi Arabia is a key Western security partner. So your view of Saudi Arabia is closely linked to your view of this war. And in the past in the US, Yemen was pretty much only seen through the lens of Al-Qaeda. There was one simplistic way of viewing it, and that has basically changed to being viewed much more through the Iran-Saudi lens. But I think one important thing to bear in mind is that this isn't a conflict that started with Iran or with Saudi Arabia. They've really come later to use their role here for larger regional ends. That's not to deny Saudi Arabia obviously has quite direct internal security concerns linked to Yemen as its neighbour, but it's taken on this much greater symbolic importance where you can talk to normal people in the Gulf who say this is where it will be decided who has won between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is actually hard to understand, but it's how a lot of media rhetoric has portrayed this thing, whereas what happens in Yemen has got a lot more to do with the dynamics on the ground in Yemen and the territory and the local fighting groups and so on. But I think it's important to bear in mind that the roots of this conflict are much more local, and they do have a lot more to do with political economy struggles and frustrated regionalism. As in many countries, you've had an elite heavily concentrated in the capital who have traditionally benefited more from the country's resources than pretty much anybody else. Grievances in all of Yemen's regions, not only the south, have festered for a long time, but in 2011, you saw the wave of uprisings across the Arab world, and you saw the Yemeni elite start to splinter, and that created an opportunity, people thought, for some kind of transition and change, which was then spoiled by a coalition of the former President Saleh and the Houthis, the two groups who thought they had the most to lose from the way that the transition was going. But when we eventually come back to a political process to look at peace for Yemen, it is going to have to address the centrifugal pressures from the different regions. The south is the most obvious one, but also other regions. And the pressures for better governance, because we can see from many other examples elsewhere that decentralization or even independence as a state doesn't necessarily solve your governance problems. And often people think they're all one and the same things. Perhaps we're about to find that out with Brexit. But so there is unfortunately still not yet a political process that is actually addressing these national root causes of the conflict. We haven't managed to get to that stage yet, which is worrying. And for now, a lot of the question is about to what extent can you try to take this conflict out of the Iran-Saudi regional proxy war, or at least encourage those powers to think that they will benefit from being peacemakers more than from sponsors of groups that are involved in the war in different ways. There has been a hopeful sign with Stockholm in that it seems to represent a moment when those regional players thought that their reputations would benefit from supporting the talks. What we don't know is how deep that commitment goes. Clearly, there are also arguments in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. There are those who think that they still need a decisive military victory and they need to acquire more territory, and some of them think that Stockholm has basically stopped them from having that. And of course, in Iran, there's quite a lot of schadenfreude about the damage that's been done to Saudi Arabia's international reputation by this war. That's sometimes used as a bit of a distraction from Iran's own complicity in abuses, both in Yemen, but to a much greater extent in Syria. But I think because of public opinion, NGO campaigning, and parliamentary pressure in Britain and the US, and even to some extent in France, there has been a moment where, for the UAE and Saudi Arabia, they've thought this is too much for our reputations, especially the UAE, which has a kind of strong reputation to lose. Where Saudi Arabia, to some extent, has been used to criticism for a long time. And for Iran, it's interesting, you mentioned the nuclear deal. I think the Iranians, or at least those of them who really want to keep engaging with Europe and stay in the nuclear agreement, they have found it quite useful to be able to say, look, Yemen is a place where we can play a constructive role. The US isn't talking to us. We weren't invited to Stockholm, but we will encourage the Houthis to go to the Stockholm talks. What needs to happen now is quite concerted pressure on all the players who have influence with any of the groups, and that would include also Oman with the Houthis and various others, to keep paying attention to the details, because Stockholm was almost declared as a victory too early, and the devil is in the details, and even the prisoner exchanges have not really progressed.
What would be, if you zoom out, there has been no attention in Yemen. Even today, we see quite rare interest on Yemen, even from the audience. There is a moment post and before Khashoggi that everyone paid attention into Yemen after that moment, suddenly. Possibly also because everyone got tired of Syria. But how does this change the dynamics within the UK? Is it less comfortable now, for example, to be an ally of Saudi Arabia? And how do you think, if at all, the Qatari risk problem will affect on Yemen or any other part of the region? And most importantly, is it safe to make any comparison between the conflict in Yemen and the one in Syria, the one in Libya? Is it a part of a larger disorder, or they are very different and we should not look to them the same way, in any way?
I mean, there are common threads in all these conflicts because they arise locally from sort of deep problems with governance, and then questions about whether the state itself can survive political transitions away from long-term leaders. And then you see really a region where there's a missing element. There's no successful regional organisation that really has the capacity to solve these problems, to mediate, to deploy peacekeepers. And there's a general sense that the kind of US underwritten security order in the region is changing or crumbling in some way, and countries are competing in a very zero-sum way to see who will be the next leader, rather than trying to find a way to maybe look at some of the regional organisations in other parts of the world and develop more capacity to solve those problems.
When the Iranians now, for the first time, say, we will talk to the Houthis, as Jen is saying, in the last 3 years, you talk to them about the Houthis, and they say, the Houthis, how do you spell that? Who are this group? Denying extremely that they don't know them. Now they're saying, we will talk to them. How much is there a command and control between the Iranians and the Houthis? How much there is a myth and the realities in that complex, it's complicated relationship? Do they really can talk to them, Rafat? Can they, is it a similar relationship between Hezbollah and Tehran or different one?
My own assessment is that it's a different one. My own assessment is that it's not a command and control view. I think Iran is very smart about overplaying their role and what they can offer. And I think they've had the best return on investment in Yemen, whatever they are supporting. And there is definite support for the Houthis. We can see it definitely on the media side, for sure, where all the Houthi media organizations are based in Beirut and Hezbollah areas, and all the support that they received on that. I'm sure there is a lot of weapons support and some military experience, but I never sense that the relationship is that Iran is actually the one who are calling the shots on the Houthis. The Houthis still, I believe, have a long way from being just told, do this or not do that by Iran. I think Oman and Muscat has much more influence on the Houthis, given what they have provided them so far, the safe haven, let's say, all the support, communication channels, the hosting them there, and I think that makes a huge difference. And we've seen it with a lot of the release of American hostages, for example, and other foreign hostages in Sana'a. Whenever the Sultan of Oman makes a request, immediately the Houthis would oblige. So I think we can see clearly the influence of Oman. And again, it's not in terms of commanding, but a very strong relationship and back and forth. But we never see that kind of relationship directly when it comes to Iran.
Speaking of Omanis, can you say a bit of the increasing role of Oman, not just between the Houthis and the world, but even within the Israelis going this way, increasing regional player? And within that framework, what can or should other frameworks other than the UN try to solve this conflict? Is the UN alone capable? Should we involve Oman? If so, are we looking for a Yemeni Astana? Are you looking for is the Quad didn't work? What's the deal from a regional point of view, but also what's up? What other Gulf countries are up to? Oman, Kuwait, most importantly, I guess, who are the least involved in this conflict?
Well, Oman has never been in favour of the Gulf intervention in Yemen. They stood apart from it, and essentially they think that the way that the war has gone has confirmed their concerns that this would not be the quick and easy victory that some expected. But there's also a new element for the Omanis. You mentioned the GCC crisis with Qatar. And that has really created a new sense of insecurity in Oman, where people have thought, if our friends and brothers in other Gulf states wanted to do something like this to us, for example, over our relationship with Iran, we would not have the resources that Qatar has to withstand it. So Qatar has basically been able to cope because it has such massive gas and investment capabilities. And Oman has worried, and people will discuss this with you quite openly if you're visiting from the UK, it has worried that if the US and UK were forced to choose between Saudi and UAE on one side and Oman on the other, that they would not choose Oman. So they have a lot of anxieties generally about their security and a lot of questions about what the long-term aims of their neighbours are in Yemen. But they do have that traditional role as, they prefer not to say mediators, but as facilitators. And I think there has been quite a pragmatic attitude from everybody really towards their relations with the Houthis, because it's better for other Gulf countries that the Houthis have some relationship with Muscat than only a relationship with Tehran. Beyond that, I think Qatar has been, it's basically shifted from being part of the coalition to airing criticisms of the war every day because of its rift with Saudi Arabia. But it's not a country that would have the capacity to really mediate or be trusted in this. And finally, the role of Kuwait is quite important. They hosted the previous round of UN peace talks. They provided logistical assistance to get the Houthis to Stockholm. So although they are part of the coalition, they've also shown a strong interest in finding a political way forward, and that could play a continuing role in the future, I think.
Yeah, and what's Oman doing in Mahra, or what worried of in Mahra, actually, if you can build on that? Are we going to see more active role of Oman there? Is it soon joining the Me Too movement? What's happening basically with that in Yemen?
Yeah, because I think that's one of the biggest shifts in Oman policy as well, was that when the red line was crossed, and the red line has been always clear in Al-Mahra, and when UAE and Saudi started interfering in Mahra, creating forces, taking control of the borders and the airport, Oman, I think, over the past at least 9 months, has started shifting their stand, as you said. So up until last year, I would say they tried as much as possible to be that more neutral player and more facilitator of the process. But I think now they feel more and more they have some skin in the game as well. They feel they are being threatened by this advancement to Al-Mahra. And I think we are seeing a change in their approach to the Yemeni file, at least, let alone the regional changes that are happening. So I think Mahra is going to be critical in how Oman continues their role in Yemen.
Aren't you worried we're running out of brokers in the region? Suddenly everyone is slowly becoming more part of the problem. How does that impact not just Yemen, but overall Libya and Syria? Does that worry you?
Absolutely. It's a massive problem that the region really needs some countries that can be neutral and leaders who see leadership as making peace and building states. And that doesn't seem to be the dominant trend. And some of the leaders that are still looked to as potential mediators, like the Emir of Kuwait or the Sultan of Oman, are obviously of the generation of grandparents.
Great, thank you very much. I will open it for questions. Please introduce yourself. Say something beyond member house or Chatham House member, unless you're ashamed of your affiliation. You also can ask question online on SH events on the hashtag. Please use that. But say your name and where you work from. You can have your hand up if you have any question. No questions?
We did such a good job
Yeah.
answering all the questions.
No, or it seems they're part of a sketchy affiliation, so no one wants to say what they are. Now, wait for the microphone, please.
I'm James, and I was actually a student who was in the library and saw the title of the talk. I thought it was quite interesting. I've just looked at a map of the Yemeni conflict, and one of the big patches of land appears to be occupied by Al-Qaeda, and that isn't actually a phrase that came up far too much in this discussion. Could you explain a bit more about that?
Yeah. What's Al-Qaeda up to in Yemen, Rafat?
I think you know more about Al-Qaeda because you've done a lot of work and research on Al-Qaeda. But I think, at some point, again, there's one of the trends that they did have at the beginning of the war a lot of control over some governorates, including in Hadramaut and in different places. Right now, at least from what I see, but you know much more, they don't control wide areas of Yemen or entire governorates or significant areas of Yemen, but their presence is still there. And as Jane mentioned, that is still one of the main lenses that Yemen is seen, especially from the defense side in the US and the UK and elsewhere. But I think you know much more about Al-Qaeda than I do.
No, I think on Al-Qaeda, there is two different ways you need to think of or not think of. First is within the civil war, within the regional war, there is a thriving of armed groups. If you have a gun, you basically have more power. And Al-Qaeda falls under that category. The second thing you need to think of when thinking of Al-Qaeda is, as an organization, it is weaker than any other time in its life because it no more is able to function as a national organization with one structure, with one command and control. At the same time, it's a group that has gained most resources from money, from guns, from sectarian increasing radicalization, but also spent the least. It's not in war with anyone. So far, it's the big winner, more or less, of this war because it has invested and it hasn't used any of that. It picks and chooses its battles. That's also contrary to what ISIS is. ISIS in Yemen is very ambitious, but it's not going to go further because it doesn't have a local, not a local roots, but I would say from ISIS, for example, every single leader in Yemen is a foreigner. Al-Qaeda have never, ever imposed a leader on a local society unless he's from the local society. So there is this quite, I think, terrifying decentralization. And this goes back all the way to Osama bin Laden's school 10 years ago, where he used to tell Qaeda in Yemen, he has this policy in which Gregory Johnson categorizes as centralization of decision, decentralization of implementation. Meaning he would tell the leader in Yemen, I want a bombing. Where, when, how is your job? You decide that based on your own calculations of the reality in the ground. And that continues to happen in many frameworks and in many ways at the moment. And again, it's a war. So if you have a gun, you will have more rule, and that applies to Al-Qaeda. But do you think the UN can solve this conflict alone, by the way?
I mean, there are a lot of efforts at local levels to have ceasefires, understandings, bridge gaps among communities, and ultimately that's going to be key to whether there's a sustainable peace. I think the UN has got more of a role to play than in some places in the region because at least the Security Council is fairly united around wanting to move towards peace and address the humanitarian situation. So it's not like Syria, where part of the reason that the Astana process has worked has been because the UN has been paralysed by those Russia-US divisions. But at the same time, the UN is operating, very much at the level of states, and in the case of the Houthis, of course, not a state, but a group that's in de facto control of the capital. And Yemen's a country where the government in the capital has always had only limited rule over the rest of the country. I think there's a huge amount of interest in what kind of tribal conflict resolution mechanisms can do at a local level, and then questions about how much do those operate today and how much do they get taken seriously by younger people, what kind of effect do they have on women, etc. But every effort has got some role to play here.
How much is Yemen war, and it's a repetitive question, but I think it's important, how much of it is local and how much of it is regional or proxy? In another word, tomorrow the outside decides to back off and we don't need Jen in the next panel. How much of that conflict will remain or how much it will not remain? Can you tell us a bit about that?
I think it's still a lot. There are two tracks to resolving, I think, the Yemeni conflict. One track is fully local, and I'll talk maybe a little bit about that. And the other track is resolving the issue between the Houthis and Saudi. And without reaching an agreement of some sort that satisfies Saudi that there will not be threats out of Yemen in their backyard, that the Houthis are not going to act as an Iranian proxy in their backyard, that they're not going to be targeted by ballistic missiles, that their borders will be protected. Only the Houthis can guarantee that. Nobody else, the government cannot guarantee it. And I think the Saudis know that. They know that the only protector that they will ultimately rely on their borders and everything, is going to be the Houthis if it continues. So without a deal that ends this Houthi-Saudi, and I think it's unfortunately a deal that if we don't reach it has a very long horizon, because it's between Mohammed bin Salman and Abdul Malik al-Houthi, both of them 35 years old. They have at least another 50 years to go if they continue at that. So if they don't reach an agreement and I think maybe beyond the kind of the formal processes, the peace agreements, all that, it really comes down to two things, realpolitik-wise. Mohammed bin Salman and Abdul Malik al-Houthi reaching an agreement. Either Abdul Malik al-Houthi agrees to bend the knee and go to Mohammed bin Salman and agree to guarantee the borders, fully shift things, or Mohammed bin Salman agrees to change his position, does what King Faisal did back in the 60s, from a supporter of one side to a convener of peace, and calls all Yemenis and says, okay, Saudi is now going to be the chaperone, champion of peace in Yemen, and you all come to us. One of them changes their position, or some external actor is able, and it's not going to be the UN, is able to negotiate something like that. That's on one side. On the other side, the real question comes down to three groups, two in the stage one and the third in the stage two. The two groups are the Houthis and Islah. Are we able to get Houthis and Islah agreement? Is the way out of war brokering a Houthi-Islah agreement? Which it doesn't seem the regionals, Saudi and UAE specifically, are willing to entertain that one. But locally, if we want to reach peace in this big war that is happening right now, the big war within Yemen, if the Houthis and Islah don't reach agreement, then the only alternative option, again, very crude, not process or whatever, the only alternative option is creating a new power, which is what I think everyone has been trying to do and failed so far, but creating a new power that can take over, and I think UAE and Saudi have been looking actively for the Haftar or someone who can kind of bring everything together. It's going to have to be a military leader of some sort, of the CC or whoever, but that is not there today in Yemen. So we have Houthis and Islah. Either they reach agreement, some power sharing arrangement, some trust between them, and Yemen settles based on that, or they don't, and a third power comes in and is fully supported and is able, a leader emerges who is able to bring all the other forces together and crack down on the Houthis and Islah. If those two options are not there, I think the conflict will continue. The third, which I refer to as stage two, is the southern issue and the southern powers that are being created and promoted right now. And they are still fragmented. They are still not as strong ideologically as Islah and Houthis, not as organized and with a clear command structure there. But if an agreement is not reached with them, and if they continue to receive the support that they do, peace will not be there. I think these are the two tracks that are needed to get to peace in Yemen.
It's interesting how for 45 minutes we have been speaking, or 40 minutes, and none of us mentioned the President Hadi. And I want you to think of the question, which is the elephant in the room, but no one dares to ask it, is what if Hadi dies? Is that another U-turn in Yemen's conflict? But before that, I want to ask Jane a psychological question almost, is how much of this is MBS own war? How much of this has been a gamble? And how much of this has been part of kind of empowering or disempowering him within Saudi at all? Is that an aspect we should be thinking of when we think of conflict resolution on Yemen?
I think the war has been very, very closely associated with him, both in Saudi Arabia and internationally. Some Saudi officials will tell you that that's unfair or not true, or the plans were drawn up before, but regardless of that, the perception is very much that this is a war spearheaded by a young man who has a very strong interest in making Saudi Arabia a credible military power, and has also simultaneously embarked on quite a big program of reform and modernization in the army. But it's very difficult to do that at the same time as fighting a war. The two things haven't necessarily gone well together. But this is part of the issue, and I think, quietly within Saudi Arabia, within the establishment, there has been criticism of the war from the outset. That many said this won't be a quick war, and they feel proven right. But it does mean that, as in so many conflicts, there is a big element of face saving. And the assumption, basically, among most of the allies of Saudi Arabia is that the Saudi leadership is looking for a face-saving way out, as long as that is a compromise that addresses their real local security needs and their security concerns that have multiplied since the start of the war, with the Houthis getting missile capability, but also some formula that means that they do not look as though they were chased away by a group that Iran would be extremely supportive of and kind of trumpeting as a blow against Saudi Arabia. So that is the assumption that many international countries are working on, that Saudi Arabia does want a way out and needs help. But I do also have a question about whether that is definitely true, and whether the Saudi leadership does see Yemen as essentially a failure that needs to be wrapped up, or whether from their point of view they think things would have been worse if we didn't go in, and because we are reforming our army over time, we will get better at this.
Before I give you the chance, I wanted to see if anyone else in the room has a question. Please. And then if anyone else, just raise your hand. Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Jamie Pladel-Beaver. I'm with Crisis Action. I wanted to ask about international actors outside the region. So what we've just got onto is this idea that Saudi Arabia, at least as the main coalition partner, needs both sort of carrots and sticks to push it in the right direction. If we're thinking about the UK, for example, or the US, pen holders on the Security Council for the UK, arms, continuing to sell arms. I mean, what do you think are the opportunities for international actors outside the region?
And I'll take one more question from the lady back. Anyone else has a question?
Hello, Shreya from Decisive. My question is related to Southern inclusion in the political process and the stage 2 that Rafa referred to. There is increasing calls to include them as part of the wider peace process, but there is the complexity in the fact that there's internal fragmentation in the south and no group or entity that represents all the different groups. So the question is, when should the south be engaged and how?
And I'll take one last one from her.
If you go back to the beginning of sorry?
Your name?
James Spencer. If you go back to the beginning of the conflict, there was very little talk of Iran at all. It was all about the Houthis replacing the Hadi government. One potential explanation for that is that it was the Saudis objecting to their effectively client state government being taken over by what was then effectively one of the factions within the Arab Spring. If that is the case, Iran nominally getting out of where it probably isn't very deeply in isn't going to solve the problem. Can you suggest what will solve that problem?
We can start with you, Rafat, and then we can go back to Jen.
Maybe I'll take first the question on when should the South be included, and I think it's I don't know if anyone has the answer for the South or not, but the assumption of the design of the peace process so far has been that we would first start by stopping the military actors who are actively fighting, reaching a peace agreement there, and then opening up for a transitional period where all the other factions can come together. And there's the South, but even within the South, as you know, Hadramaut has their own thing. But there's also increasingly, Marib and Taiz and whatever not happy with the status quo. But the idea, it seems, that there is envisioned a transitional period similar to 2012 to 2014, where kind of maybe a revisiting of the NDC outcomes, a revisiting of the current status, and agreeing on there. So that's how it is, at least until now, envisioned. The assumption there was as well that we need to get to a quick resolution of this war, and therefore we don't want to widen the circle. But it's been taking 4 years so far, and it seems it's not ending anytime soon. So I guess it's a valid question of whether we should since we're taking our time anyways, get started on that process of figuring out what the new arrangement is that will satisfy everyone. And I know there's a lot of efforts both on track 2 level and other levels, but I think that question is still unresolved. And I can totally see if they are included today on the table when the discussions is about reaching, for example, a ceasefire or stopping the current war, where they don't have much to add to that conversation because their conversation is a different part of figuring out the position of the South within the future of Yemen. So it's a very tricky, I don't know if there's an answer or not, but it doesn't seem the current process is getting anywhere. So I think it's up for revisiting that question.
Again, I know they never die from Algeria to Lebanon, but again, the question, what if Hadi dies? And then I give it to Jamie. Well, where do we go? Seriously, that's a big question. Do we have an entire UN Security Council resolution under one man or under his name? What is the structure we're going to have after that? That's just another U-turn. I can't think. What might happen?
I think there's been a lot of discussions on the government side under the title of reforming the legitimacy, as they call it. And it's was trying to aim at reordering the House and actually, bringing back the political parties, reviving the parliament, a lot of discussions around what to do there specifically to address such a scenario or in general to revive the leadership on the government side. They're not getting anywhere with that discussion, and all efforts to get there has failed so far. And I think so it continues to be the choke point of what happens. I mean, theoretically, if Hadi passes away, then we have the vice president, Ali Mohsen, so we are in safe hands. But nobody knows what happens. And I think that's one of the biggest concerns as well, from what I sense from the coalition as well, is what is this government look like that we are supporting, and are we supporting a person or are we supporting a wide...
And I think that was one of the biggest sense of the diplomacy in Yemen since 2011, which is centering entire process around one person. You don't even give a chance to him falling in the bathroom and dying. And that you entirely put the entire process safety around one thing or one man, which is dangerous. But Jane, please.
Well, also in the case of Hadi, he was essentially appointed and then validated by a referendum where he was the only option for a transitional process. He was supposed to be in power for a year until elections would be held. So the positive side of that is that he's not somebody who's trying to come in as a president for life. But the negative side of that is that he does have a certain insecurity about his own position. And if peace is reached and the previous kind of transition ideas were returned to, he would be one of the people who would stand to lose because his position is temporary. So that's a concern. On James's question, I think it's a very good and important one that, even if we imagined that all the issues between Saudi and Iran were sort of resolved overnight or disappeared, Saudi Arabia would still have massive security concerns relating to Yemen, massively increased as a result of the war because of their involvement there, the level of civilian casualties and so forth. There are, many people who will grow up hating their neighbour, and that in a country where the border is hard to police and it's awash with small arms. So I think your point, Rafat, about some kind of Saudi Houthi deal is a very important one. And it seems that there are at least some relative pragmatists in the Houthi side who are also aware that if they are to have any chance of staying in power, they'll need to have some kind of arrangement with their big neighbour, and that importantly, Iran is not going to bail Yemen out financially. But whether those people actually win the day is another question. On the UK, US and other international players, they are vital because the coalition, bluntly, it can't sustain the military intervention without continued support from its Western partners. As yet, the Gulf Coalition doesn't have the capability to do it without them. And they might say, 10, 20 years down the line, we'll be doing this with support for China or Russia, but that's not a current option either militarily or politically. And I think Stockholm is an example where we've seen international pressure coming through Western parliaments actually having some effect. And then we get back to the question of how is that sustained for the amount of time that is needed to get that agreement working and build something that's larger and more political and more inclusive.
If I may, I think that the key question that we need the answer to, and I don't know if we'll get the answer to, is what is the objectives of or the ultimate goal or the best case scenario that Saudi and UAE can get in Yemen in the next, let's say, 20 years? And are they both on the same page on those objectives? And I see three options, and if anyone can answer this question of where do they fall on these three options? Because the first option is a strong and stable Yemen with Houthis and Islah a significant part of that Yemen. That's the first option. The second option is a strong and stable Yemen with no place for Houthis and eventually no place for Islah, which is what Islah is always worried about, that they're next on the list if this war ends.
Islah is the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yes.
Yeah.
The third option is controlled chaos. And is that the best case scenario that Saudi and UAE aiming for, settling for, can only have in Yemen in the absence of the first two options, which is leave it as this mess, divide, fragment, chaos, but chaos to a level that we can control and keep it at that for the next 20 years until we figure out what happens. If we get clarity on where the objective is and whether both of them are on the same page, I think that's a critical question.
That's what I'm saying. You speak of UAE and Saudi as if there is not even any spelling difference between MBZ and MBS. And that's quite interesting to watch as a trend. But I do want to also add the point on the Iran question is, contrary to Iran, to the Saudis, Yemen is not a foreign policy. Yemen is a national security, is a domestic issue. Even the file is in the hands of the Ministry of Interior. It's not in the hands of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's not in the hands of any other agency. This is a domestic affair, and that changes the way how we should look into Saudis, look into Yemen at the moment. Any more questions from the ground? Yes, ma'am, please. Give her the question. Anyone else?
Chiara Betta, member of Chatham House. I would like to ask you, what's the position of Israel in the conflict?
Any other questions? Yes, please.
Joseph Garbuni, member of Chatham House. After Stockholm and after Khashoggi, there was big optimism that things are moving and the war is about to end. And then slowly but surely it's gone back. And now the negotiations are about opening a street somewhere, and they've completely forgotten about the whole. Any comment? Why?
So if you want to take on the one on the Israel.
So Israel has got limited kind of direct strategic interest in Yemen. But something that's been absolutely key for Israel, and particularly for Prime Minister Netanyahu, has been to publicly emphasize his newfound but still kind of unacknowledged relations with the Gulf countries. And you've seen increasingly, you mentioned Netanyahu's visit to Oman, but you've seen Israeli officials appearing publicly in Abu Dhabi. You've seen this controversial leaking of videos from the Warsaw Conference that showed Israelis and Gulf officials very much on the same page about Iran. And so, Netanyahu's been keen really to kind of underline Israel's support for the security objectives of the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And when the Houthis have sort of threatened shipping in the Bab el-Mandeb, Netanyahu did publicly hint that if there were more serious attempts to disrupt shipping, this was an area where Israel could potentially become involved, which is something quite new. So I think really for Israel, it's not that much to do with the kind of local factors in Yemen, but trying to encourage the perception that there's a close linkage of interests between Israel and the Gulf capitals.
And that there is one united enemy, which is Iran, for the Gulf and Israel. That's the more important, I think, also in the long term. something in question in Stockholm?
Yeah, I think, back to what I mentioned earlier, we see these blips of interest. The only sustained interest we see is on the humanitarian file, where there's a lot of attention there. But unfortunately, Yemen is not on the top of the agenda, and that's what I was mentioning to Jane as well earlier before the session. The international community, quote unquote, is not in a hurry to end this war in Yemen at all. The only time, again, we see the blips is through the lens of Saudi. So as you said, Jamal Khashoggi, whether positively or negatively, whenever Saudi is in the picture, that's when the interest is there. But on the war specifically and ending the conflict, very little interest there at the very highest level. I'm talking, a lot of the day-to-day work is happening, but the highest level of actually having that decision, the war has to stop, and ending it is not there yet, I think.
I want to pick up on something that you said about the different scenarios for Yemen and sort of where does the Gulf stand. I'm not sure the Gulf states have entirely a clear picture of where they think they definitely can get to. But, on one side, there's obviously going to be a lot of anxieties about future security threats from Yemen, which will make them have an interest in governments that can control that, but also probably not want a government that would be very strong and have a really powerful army, just in case, in the way that you still see Iran not sure it really wants a very strong Iraq or a very powerful Iraqi army for much different historical reasons, obviously. But something that maybe can be built on is that the Saudi Arabia and the UAE also have got an interest in Yemen that can be more prosperous. And it's interesting that when we look at it in the Western media, it is very much through the lens of a war-ravaged country that is starving and that has for a long time been one of the poorest countries in the Arab world and has basically no resources. But clearly the UAE in particular sees something about Yemen which is prosperous, which is somewhere that can rise again as a centre for trade and link up with kind of budding economies in the Horn of Africa and the huge market in Ethiopia and all of these places. And that might be something to work with.
Yeah, which is why I think I emphasized a strong and stable Yemen, because if we talk about the Houthis, and that's not a vision they will accept, not a vision of and I think many people as well would not accept a vision of Yemen as a follower, as a subservient of UAE or any others, as a weak with no military, with no whatever, and we'll just, as long as we're prosperous, we're okay. That's not a vision that clicks with many of the Yemenis, and on the political scene, definitely not with the Houthis, which is why I think one option is a strong and stable Yemen where the Houthis and Islah are inevitably part of it, or the other option is controlled chaos, or a strong and stable Yemen where the Houthis are not there, because they will not accept this, and Islah probably as well, and many others. So finding some alternative power that can accept that.
We have less than 2 minutes, but I want to ask you a last question, Rafat. Bliss policy, which is 5 years or 8 years, whatever, of 5 years of national war or civil war, 4 years of regional intervention, 8 years of Arab Spring, which was mostly led by youth. What's left there for youth? Only economy is in the front lines, only jobs is there. There are no heroes, those who actually don't, other than those who carry guns. What's left for a generation there, which is more than 70% of the country, under the age of 30? And just for the sake of context, also, Rafat was former Minister of Youth in Yemen. We, his friends, joke that he should have a book called 70 Days in Power, because that's how long his government stayed. And that was the last kind of a semi-Yemeni government in Yemen. But yeah, what's, in less than 1 minute, if you can tell us something.
I think youth are the most concerned right now, because as you said, it's bleak. And if we don't continue to ignite that flame of hope that there's something better coming, what they are seeing right now is only options to take a weapon and join one of the groups here or there and fight with them, because otherwise you wait in your home and you'll be killed by either starvation or by a rocket from one of the groups. So I think that should be a priority. So far, as you said, it's not there. Young people don't have something to aspire to, don't have a hope and heroes to look up to. And if that doesn't change soon, I think we're just going for many more years of war, unfortunately.
On that depressing note, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for being here today, and thanks very much to our speakers who joined us here. Thank you.